Imagine a young girl growing up in the remote desert landscape of Ely, Nevada, already juggling family tragedies and heavy responsibilities by her teenage years. That girl was Pat Nixon, quiet, resilient, and propelled by a determination few could match. In this video, we uncover her transformative journey from small-town hardships to the corridors of the White House, revealing how she balanced public scrutiny, global diplomacy, and personal heartbreak with unwavering grace. Prepare to meet the Pat Nixon history rarely talks about, the First Lady defined by quiet power and a passion for giving back. Pat Nixon began her life on March 16, 1912. Born into a family that had already tasted hardship and sacrifice, she seemed destined for a life where grit and resilience would serve as her guiding lights. She was born Thelma Catherine Ryan, though she would swiftly become known by the more casual and straightforward nickname Pat, a nod to the fact that she arrived in the world just ahead of St. Patrick's Day. Her parents, William Ryan and Kate Halberstadt Bender Ryan, were hard-working, down-to-earth people who deeply valued resilience and self-reliance. William was no stranger to the rough life of a miner and later a farmer, while Kate managed the household, balancing the demands of child-rearing and the constant economic pressures that many families in small-town Nevada faced at the turn of the century. Pat was the kind of child who seemed preternaturally aware of how difficult life could be. Perhaps it was this backdrop that set the stage for her to become a person who took life's tragedies in stride, always believing she had no choice but to soldier on. In many ways, her early childhood reads like a microcosm of that American frontier ethos. Life is tough, but you get tougher. She faced great loss young. By the time she was 13, she was thrust into a caregiver's role when her mother was diagnosed with liver cancer. There's something heartrending about a teenage Pat, only barely out of childhood herself, becoming a kind of family nurse, tending to her mother at home. Day after day, she did her best to ease her mother's suffering, all while the household tasks piled up around her. Then came the moment no child is truly ever ready for. Kate Ryan passed away on November 2nd, 1925, at just 44 years old. Pat's world cracked, and in those immediate shards of grief, she was forced to step forward, holding the family together as well as an adolescent could. It was a harsh introduction to adult responsibilities. Pat's father, William Ryan, was a survivor in spirit, but years of mining had done a number on his lungs. After Kate's death, William tried his best to keep the family afloat, but silicosis, a lung disease common among miners, was creeping ever closer. Pat continued with her studies while juggling household responsibilities. Even as a teenager, she approached every job, every dish washed, every piece of laundry folded, with a sort of stoic pride. Her classmates might have seen her as quiet or even withdrawn, but there was a simmering resilience behind those gentle eyes. By the time she turned 18, tragedy struck again. William Ryan died of silicosis on May 7, 1930, at the age of 53. This loss was a brutal blow to Pat. Already having lost her mother, Pat now stood at the crossroads of adulthood without her parents' guiding hands. But it was precisely in these times of sadness that an uncanny determination emerged in her. She left Ely determined to forge ahead, believing wholeheartedly that education was the key to a life of greater possibilities. Pat's next step was the University of Southern California. Attending USC became a milestone in her life. She was older than many of her classmates, as she had taken time away from the standard schooling trajectory due to family responsibilities. Yet she embraced this new chapter with enthusiasm. Even though money was a constant concern, Pat balanced a series of odd jobs, everything from office work to more menial tasks to help pay for tuition and books. Underneath that poised exterior, she was perpetually thinking about how to make ends meet, while still maintaining the grades required to stay afloat academically. Ultimately, her diligence paid off. She graduated cum laude in 1937 with a Bachelor of Arts. That academic honor wasn't just a feather in her cap. It stood as a testament to the hundreds of nights she spent studying while her peers could afford to socialize more freely. She was someone who understood that respect often came from the steadiness of one's own commitment, and she was determined to earn that respect. Fresh out of college, Pat discovered that her calling might be in shaping young minds. She took up a teaching position at a local high school in Whittier from 1937 to 1940. And there she was, standing in front of teenagers not all that much younger than she had been when her own mother died, trying to spark their curiosity, stoke their ambitions, and encourage them to dream beyond their present circumstances. Former students later recalled she was a gentle presence, but not one to be trifled with. She carried herself with the same composed resolve that had characterized her entire upbringing. For many in Whittier, this is the first time they truly took notice of Pat Ryan, the earnest, hard-working teacher who seemed to have a quiet fire in her soul. It was around this time that fate introduced her to a man who would transform her life and, for better or worse, overshadow much of her personal story in the years to come, Richard Milhouse Nixon. Legend has it that they met at an amateur theater audition, and although the details are sometimes contested or romanticized, what's undeniable is that Richard found something magnetic in Pat. He courted her with a persistence that bordered on single-minded determination. It was the kind of courtship filled with daily letters and frequent phone calls, each one brimming with Richard's ambition and convictions about the future. Pat, ever level-headed, initially kept him at arm's length, unsure if she was ready to hitch her fortunes to someone with such high political aspirations. But as she observed the earnestness in his eyes and the big dreams swirling in his head, she agreed to see where it would lead. In many ways, Pat and Richard mirrored each other's drive. Both came from humble beginnings, both understood personal struggle, and both believed in the capacity for self-improvement. They married on June 21st, 1940. It was a modest ceremony, reflecting their limited financial resources at the time. Their honeymoon was similarly unassuming, but what they lacked in grandiosity, they made up for in determination. Pat stood by Richard as he pursued his legal career and ventured into politics. He was soon drafted into the U.S. Navy during World War II, and Pat continued teaching, waiting patiently for him to return. There was a practical side to Pat's devotion. She was used to rolling with life's punches. If wartime separation was what fate demanded, then she would deal with it, building a life in his absence and preparing for whatever came next. Richard's political star began to rise sharply after the war. First, he won a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives, then a U.S. Senate seat, and soon, by 1953, he was vice president under Dwight D. Eisenhower. For Pat, each political victory represented a new series of adjustments. She now had to master a more public role, standing beside her husband during campaign events, shaking hands at rallies, and delivering small speeches. The inner teacher in her knew how to connect with people in a gentle, instructive way, and many found her refreshing compared to more flamboyant political wives of the era. By the time 1960 rolled around, Richard Nixon was the Republican nominee for president. Though he lost narrowly to John F. Kennedy, it thrust Pat even further into the national spotlight. She had to field questions about her life, her marriage, and her opinions on policy far more frequently. The entire family dynamic also shifted as she tried to shield her two young daughters, Patricia Tricia, born 1946, and Julie, born 1948, from the harshness of political scrutiny. But even in defeat, Pat remained resolute. She believed wholeheartedly that her husband's time would come. Though the heartbreak of that lost election was real, she treated it as just another bump in the road. And of course that time did come. In 1968, after some years on the sidelines, Richard Nixon staged an impressive political comeback, clinching the presidency against Hubert Humphrey. That victory in November spelled a transition into the White House for Pat, the same building she had visited many times with her husband during his vice presidency. But now she would step in as First Lady. She took a deep breath and plunged into those new responsibilities with a sense of mission that almost startled veteran White House staffers. From 1969 to 1974, Pat Nixon brought a different flavor to the role of First Lady. Unlike some of her predecessors, she had a keen sense of volunteerism, strongly believing in the power of everyday citizens to make a difference in each other's lives. She championed charitable causes and encouraged Americans to step up for their communities. Her initiatives included promoting the domestic volunteer program, urging people to get involved with hospitals, mental health facilities, and local charitable groups. In addition to championing volunteerism, Pat played a significant role in the restoration of the White House. She wanted it to be both a grand museum of American art and history and a warm place that could truly feel like a home for visiting dignitaries. She oversaw projects that introduced more American artwork into the corridors, believing strongly that the White House should serve as a cultural treasure for every citizen, not just a stately residence for the president's family. Staffers often noted that Pat would walk through the halls with the determined air of a curator, pointing out places where a certain painting should be showcased or where a piece of furniture might be better utilized to reflect the nation's heritage. What set her apart, however, was not just her domestic focus, but her keen willingness to step onto the global stage. Pat Nixon earned a unique moniker from the New York Times in 1972, Nixon's secret diplomatic weapon. It might sound like hyperbole, but she became an invaluable asset in her husband's international relations. It was a time marked by the Cold War's tensions, the Vietnam War's raging controversy, and an American populace weary of conflict and social upheaval. Yet Pat's warmth and poise frequently allowed her to break the ice where her husband's more formal style might have stumbled. She ultimately visited an astounding 83 countries, forging cultural connections, charming foreign dignitaries, and showing the softer side of American power. In many of those visits, she took a personal interest in local charities or hospitals, touring facilities, distributing aid, and shaking hands with ordinary people who seemed genuinely moved by her authenticity. For much of the public, this was the essential Pat, a quiet doer, uninterested in stealing the limelight, more concerned with leaving a positive impression and doing some real good along the way. But fame, especially in politics, rarely comes without scandal or rumor, and Pat Nixon was no exception. Perhaps one of the earliest and most persistent rumors was that her husband had had an affair in 1958 with someone named Mariana Liu while in Hong Kong. By the mid-1970s, these whispers had escalated to the point that the media found ways to bring them up in almost any conversation about the Nixon marriage. Pat publicly dismissed the entire story as baseless gossip, and yet certain observers noted an undercurrent of tension in her eyes whenever the subject surfaced. According to a 1974 piece in the Washington Post, there was a distinct weariness to the way she handled the rumor, as though it had weighed on her for years. It's impossible to say for certain what the truth was. In many ways, the rumor remains locked in the vault of private heartbreaks that might have tested her faith in her marriage, but never definitively broke it. Far more seismic, of course, was the fallout from Watergate, a scandal that would shake the Nixon presidency to its foundation. Prior to the scandal's full eruption, Pat had appeared on 60 Minutes in 1972, staunchly defending her husband's innocence. She spoke with confidence, clearly believing every word she said, or at the very least presenting a united front. But as the Watergate investigation progressed and the evidence mounted, people began to question her sincerity or perhaps her level of awareness. Articles in The New Yorker in 1974 painted her as naive, willfully blind, or too loyal for her own good. The critiques stung. For many Americans, it seemed inconceivable that she wouldn't question her husband behind closed doors. But for Pat, the unwavering sense of loyalty that had defined her life, first to her parents, then to Richard, was a cornerstone of her identity. Right or wrong, she believed her husband was being demonized in the press, and she would not abandon him even if it meant sacrificing her own reputation. At the same time, the press went after her for more trivial matters, such as her wardrobe. There were whispers that the First Lady's closet ran up to an extravagant $65,000, featuring a $5,000 Galanos gown that some labeled ostentatious. This was in 1970, at a moment when America's social and economic changes were front-page news every day. People were grappling with the shifting moral and cultural landscape, and the idea of a First Lady spending that kind of money on dresses rubbed plenty of folks the wrong way. Whether these stories were fully accurate or whether they were inflated for sensationalism remains a question. What's evident is that Pat felt stung and perhaps a bit baffled by the backlash. She'd grown up in rural Nevada, poor by most measures. She had lost both parents by age 18. She knew how to pinch pennies better than most. And now here she was, pilloried in the press as frivolous and out of touch. The rumors about her drinking habits emerged in the post-Watergate era as the Nixon family's stress levels skyrocketed. Whispers suggested that Pat had taken up a steady martini habit, and that at events she seemed unsteady on her feet. But her daughter Tricia would later attribute this unsteadiness to Meniere's disease, a disorder of the inner ear that can affect balance and hearing. According to the 1986 biography Pat Nixon, The Untold Story, Pat had developed an array of health issues tied to stress, including recurring bouts of vertigo, so the rumors of her drinking were, in Tricia's view, both unfair and cruel. Still, the public, hungry for more sensational details, often took these whisper campaigns at face value, rolling them into the swirling aura of scandal that enveloped the Nixon name in those tumultuous years. If the Watergate scandal was the inciting force of a cataclysm, then the resignation in August 1974 was the culminating blow to Pat's sense of pride in her husband's public service. She was 62 at the time, and the humiliation of leaving the White House was unthinkable. For someone so private, having to endure her husband's resignation was more than just a political setback. It was an emotional gut punch that threatened the very foundation of her personal world. A haunting anecdote, detailed in The Final Days, 1976, speaks of how Pat quietly packed up the White House belongings, alone after the resignation was announced. That image of a First Lady in tears packing up plates and mementos in the executive mansion has the aura of tragic poetry. It was a far cry from the triumphant tours and restored hallways she had so lovingly overseen. Now, as she placed items in boxes, she must have felt as though her entire identity was in jeopardy. Life after the White House did not magically brighten. The humiliations of Watergate shadowed the Nixon family. While Richard fought for his legacy and struggled through legal battles, Pat tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy. She traveled less, though she still made occasional appearances. Slowly, she began grappling with her own deteriorating health. In 1976, she suffered a stroke that paralyzed her left side. This once energetic woman who had gone to 83 countries, championed volunteering, and had carried such personal burdens for so many years, now found herself limited in mobility. But she fought back, undergoing therapy and trying to regain as much independence as possible. The following years brought more heartbreak. In 1983, she suffered another stroke, this time leaving her even more frail. She also developed chronic bronchitis, which lingered and flared up periodically, making travel and public appearances even more challenging. A deep sadness also accompanied the death of her brother Thomas in 1990 from cancer. Tragedy seemed to run in her family line like a persistent undertow, dragging beloved relatives away before their time. Each loss likely conjured those early memories of losing her mother and father in her adolescence, reminding her that life could be cruelly short. By the 1990s, Pat was living a relatively reclusive life in Park Ridge, New Jersey. Her public appearances were fleeting, overshadowed by her advanced age, her health struggles, and the lingering controversies from the Nixon presidency. That said, when she did appear, some commentators noted a quiet dignity in how she carried herself, a sense of acceptance, perhaps, that she had done everything she could in her lifetime to remain steadfast. She was never someone who craved the spotlight, after all. It had been thrust upon her when she chose to marry a man bent on shaping national and global affairs. On June 22, 1993, Pat Nixon passed away at the age of 81. The official cause was a combination of lung cancer and emphysema, compounded by post-stroke frailty. True to her nature, she died at home, away from the harsh lights and invasive beeps of a hospital. A few days later, on June 26th, her funeral took place at the Nixon Library in Yorba Linda, California. She was buried in the Rose Garden there, in the very place where her husband would one day join her. It was a small circle of friends, family, and old political allies who came to pay their respects. Somehow, it seemed apt that the ceremony was understated compared to other First Ladies' funerals. Pat had always been about substance over style, modesty over fanfare. Not long after her passing, the details of her will emerged. She left $500,000 to support library programs, a final testament to her belief in education and the power of knowledge. Time magazine eulogized her as a figure of silent strength, and that phrase captures in so few words what made Pat Nixon unique. She wasn't a bombastic public figure. She never aimed for the spotlight, yet she carried an inner steel that allowed her to weather numerous family tragedies, a monumental political scandal, and the glare of worldwide scrutiny. The pattern of her life, self-sacrifice, perseverance, and a kind of unspoken stoicism, remained consistent until the very end.